The richest family who vanished to be free, how power was silenced, fortune was hidden, and a dynasty chose simplicity over control to rewrite their destiny in the shadows of an ordinary village, living not to be found but to find themselves in a world that forgot their name. They lived at the edge of the village where the hills began to rise, their modest stone cottage nestled between a patch of pine forest and an overgrown field that once grew barley. To any passerby, they seemed like ordinary people. A father who worked with wood, a mother who painted flowers on old tiles, two quiet children with tidy manners, and a grandmother who spent her afternoons rocking slowly on the porch with a basket of wool beside her. Their neighbors saw them as kind but private. They never caused trouble, paid for their purchases in exact change, and showed up to every village gathering with something fresh from their garden. Their clothes were well mended, their speech humble, and their lifestyle frugal. They owned no car, no phone anyone had ever seen, and no modern appliances except a dusty radio in the kitchen. Few thought much of them. Those who did merely assumed they were people who had once had more, but chose the quiet life after hardship or loss. But the truth was far more complicated than the village could ever guess. For the Greaves family, as they called themselves now, were not who they appeared to be. Years ago, their name had once filled newspapers and been spoken in financial markets and government halls. The man known to the village as Thomas Greaves had once been a powerful magnate, steering industries from behind glass towers. His wife, Elena, had graced magazines not as a socialite but as a cultural icon with influence across continents. Their children, born to a life of unreachable luxury, had never known hunger, boredom, or danger. Their real surname had been synonymous with affluence, whispered with awe, envy, or resentment. And then they disappeared. Not due to scandal or disgrace, but by choice. The decision to walk away had not come quickly or easily. It had grown like a crack beneath the surface. Small at first, a late-night realization, a dinner party silence, a child's question that stung more than it should have. The life they had built, brick by gilded brick, had become a palace of isolation. They no longer trusted the laughter of friends. Their wealth had bought obedience, not sincerity. Their staff bowed with faces blank of expression. Their meals were planned by others. Their children, watched by guards and raised by tutors, had never touched soil or seen the stars without tinted glass in between. Thomas had watched the empire he built become a machine that no longer required him. Even his role had become ceremonial, a face, a signature. The rest ran without him, automated, calculated, and detached. His wife painted in silence, her works praised in public but unseen by anyone who truly knew her. The children, Nora and Eli, had begun to question their place in the world, a world they didn't understand and didn't feel part of. The moment of decision came quietly. There was no incident, no breach, no betrayal. Just an evening when Thomas stood alone in a room of mirrors and realized that everything he had ever feared losing had already drifted from his grasp. What remained was wealth, enormous and unshakable, but hollow. And so he resolved to disappear not as a retreat, but as an act of restoration. The plan was drawn with the same meticulous care he once applied to multinational negotiations. Layers of trust and shell companies, hidden accounts in remote banks under names invented from scratch, real estate sold in bulk, security systems erased. Associates are paid to forget. Their legal identities were buried beneath 100 false trails, their wealth disguised behind coded investments. Only 2 people in the world knew the full truth besides the family, and both had been sworn to eternal silence. When the final arrangements were made, they left behind their glass palace in the city and traveled like fugitives, though no one was chasing them. They bought the stone cottage under a fabricated history. Their story became one of retreat after failure, gentle, respectable, and humble. It fit perfectly into the village's silent spaces, the ones where everyone came to forget something. At first, it was strange, the silence, the lack of staff, the stillness of a night without distant sirens or city glow. The children had never known darkness like the countryside's darkness, soft, enveloping, absolute. They flinched at insects, grew restless without screens, and questioned the purpose of so much quiet. But slowly, life began to reshape itself around them. Thomas worked with his hands for the first time in decades. He bought scrap wood from a neighboring farm and began building simple furniture, guided only by instinct and patience. His fingers blistered and bled, then toughened. He found something in the rhythm of hammer and grain, a piece he hadn't realized he was missing. Elena, free from the need to produce work for galleries or press, returned to painting not with ambition but affection. She painted the fields, the faces of neighbors, and the wildflowers her children collected. Her palette changed, brighter but softer. Her studio was a shed warmed by the sun, and her art was no longer locked in museums. It hung in kitchens, was traded for eggs or bread, or was simply given away. The children adapted with time. Eli took to exploring the woods, naming birds and cataloging tracks. Nora read every book in the village library and began keeping journals full of drawings and maps. They stopped asking about the past and stopped questioning the limits of this new life. They stopped fearing obscurity. Only the grandmother resisted. Once the formidable head of a dynasty, she had presided over their previous life with iron poise. But age had softened her grip. Her eyes faded, her thoughts slowed, and the warmth of sunlit afternoons dulled the sharp edge of her pride. In time, even she came to accept the slow rocking of her chair and the taste of fresh milk over imported delicacies. For a time, life moved without interruption. The family found joy in anonymity. Their wealth, still untouched in secret accounts, no longer defined them. They were rich in other ways, in time, in quiet, in each other. The villagers never asked too many questions. A few noticed oddities: the children's strange vocabulary, the parents' accents that didn't quite match, and the fine stitch of their clothing despite its plainness. But in a village where privacy was honored and pasts were rarely pried into, such things were accepted. Everyone had something they didn't talk about. Years passed, the house aged with them. The furniture Thomas made wore with use. Paintings by Elena faded gently on sunlit walls. The children grew into thoughtful young adults, each carrying within them the dual legacy of privilege and simplicity. They had learned to plant, to mend, and to wait. But the world beyond their fields had not forgotten the name they once bore. Though the press had stopped searching, though their companies now moved under different banners, and though their faces had disappeared from screens, a few threads remained. Threads that curious minds occasionally tugged on. One spring, a man arrived in the village. He wore boots too new for walking and asked questions too casually. He claimed to be a travel writer, but spent more time observing than writing. He noted the Greaves' home more than once, lingering outside as if drawn to something he could not name. Thomas noticed, of course. Old instincts never truly faded. He watched the man from the shadows of his workshop, analyzing posture, timing, and roots. Elena caught the man glancing at one of her paintings in the bakery, eyes narrowing not with critique but recognition. It wasn't fear that rose in them, but awareness. They had always known this moment could come. The journalist was persistent but polite, curious but not aggressive. Still, he asked too many questions about the family, too many about their past. They said nothing. They changed nothing. They carried on as they always had, trusting that the strength of their silence would be enough. But Eli, nearly grown now, had begun to wonder about the life they had once lived. He had asked more questions lately about the old watch in his father's drawer, the books in the attic, and the documents with names that didn't match. He felt the tension. His parents didn't speak. He saw the man and understood somehow that this moment was a doorway one they might choose to open or forever keep closed. The family gathered one evening without speaking, their eyes meeting in shared thought. They didn't have to discuss the risk. It lived in all of them now, like a candle lit long ago and never fully extinguished. The next morning, the journalist disappeared from the village. No confrontation, no discovery, just absence. The village soon forgot him. But the family did not. The spring gave way to summer, and with the sun came a false sense of calm. The days passed as they had before, early mornings spent tending to the garden, afternoons filled with soft brushes on canvas, the hum of tools, and the distant murmur of bees moving lazily across lavender. The children, though older now, continued their routines with quiet precision. Nora had taken over the grandmother's herb garden and read her books aloud under the trees. Eli walked the perimeters of the property, not in play, but in watchfulness. He saw the world with sharper eyes than before, shaped by awareness more than memory. Though the stranger had gone, the disturbance he left behind settled like a thin layer of dust across everything. It wasn't fear that lingered. It was the reminder of fragility. Their secret had held through silence and care, but the world beyond had teeth, and they had heard them clink against the edges of their peace. Thomas worked longer hours in the shed. He no longer crafted for neighbors or barter. His hands shaped beams, doors, and hidden compartment structures designed to endure and to conceal. Each stroke of the plane or drive of the chisel was purposeful. He no longer built to furnish, he built to protect. Elena painted less and listened more. The wind, the crackle of twigs, the sound of unfamiliar engines far off on gravel roads, her senses, long lulled by peace, returned to their keenness. She sorted through old papers, burned what was unnecessary, and recorded what remained. Their past had not come knocking, but the door had rattled, and that was enough. It was Nora who first sensed the next shift, not with her eyes, but with her instincts. One afternoon, while walking to the village library, she noticed a man in the distance. Not the same journalist, but a different presence. He wasn't asking questions, he wasn't taking notes. He simply sat on a bench across from the school, observing the village like a man memorizing a script. His shoes were too clean, his jacket too precise, and his stillness too intentional. She didn't tell her parents right away. Instead, she returned home by a different route, circled through the forest, and arrived with leaves in her hair and questions folded tight behind her silence. Thomas had trained them well not for war, but for awareness. Every corner of their home had its blind spot mapped, every window lined with a second story. Beneath their floorboards was a passage to a hidden storage, not of gold or jewels, but of documents, tools, and identification. Their plan was not to run, but to endure. If discovery came, they would not beg or bargain. They would simply adapt. Weeks passed and nothing happened. The man did not return. The village carried on. A new family moved in near the church. The baker's daughter married. Life, indifferent to suspense, flowed forward. Then came the letter. It arrived without a stamp, hand-delivered in an unmarked envelope left beneath a flower pot on their porch. There was no threat, no accusation, just a note written in script too precise to be anything but deliberate. It contained only their real surname. One word, and everything paused. The family gathered that night, not in panic, but in communion. They had anticipated the day someone would find them, not by accident but by intent. They had prepared for the risk of exposure. But the letter changed the rules. It was a message not of chance, but of knowledge. Someone knew who they were and had chosen not to shout it, but to whisper. That was more dangerous. Thomas revisited the escape routes he had once designed, not to flee, but to stay hidden even in movement. Elena packed essential documents into a single case, the contents curated over years, a blend of the fabricated and the authentic. They spoke little, but each knew what must be done if the peace was shattered beyond repair. Yet days passed and nothing followed. No visitors, no inquiries, no sudden silences from neighbors. The village continued in its gentle rhythm, oblivious or unwilling to see the fracture behind the Greaves' windows. Eli found the next clue not by intention, but by habit. He had begun hiking further from the house, testing old trails and watching the tree lines. He saw the vehicle first as an unmarked van, parked deeper into the woods, partially covered. The tires were clean, the license plate deliberately obscured. He left no trace of his discovery, returned home through the stream to hide his scent, and told only his sister. Nora, always methodical, began cataloging the patterns. The same man at the grocer 2 days in a row. A woman pretending to buy eggs from a farmer who sold nothing. A humming device beneath the bench near the bus stop. They weren't being hunted, they were being studied. It was clear now someone had rediscovered their legacy. Not the media, not the curious, but something more calculated. It wasn't wealth that drew attention, it was access. The Greaves family in their former lives had controlled not just money, but influenced technological patents, offshore trade routes, and strategic infrastructure. Whoever watched them now didn't want to expose them. They wanted to reclaim them. But the family had made their choice long ago. They would not return to that life, not as pawns, not as symbols, not as gatekeepers of a world they had abandoned. The past could not reclaim them unless they consented. And so, quietly, they took control of their future again. Thomas sent a message not electronic, not traceable. A set of coordinates, a time, and a symbol left in an old ledger deposited in a place only one person would ever think to look. A test of loyalty, a call to the only man who still owed him a favor. 3 nights later, a fire broke out in a field near the village's edge. Not near their home, not dangerous, but distracting. Sirens came, roads closed, people watched. In the chaos, the watchers vanished. Their equipment was gone, the van disappeared, the letter's sender never returned. Nothing happened afterward, but everything changed. Thomas knew then that the world had shifted. Their anonymity had thinned. Their presence, once so quiet, now glowed faintly to those who searched with sharp eyes. They could no longer rely solely on isolation. They would need to reshape their defenses, not to run, but to remain unseen in plain sight. The family chose to adapt. They began to slowly fade deeper into the fabric of the village, not as shadows but as threads. Thomas accepted a public commission for a carved memorial in the town square. Elena began teaching art once a week to children at the community hall. Nora volunteered at the tiny clinic. Eli started a beekeeping project with the old farmer who once ignored him. They did not step forward. They simply became so necessary that their absence would have seemed unnatural. Their past was never mentioned again, not because it was forgotten, but because it was buried beneath purpose. The villagers came to trust them more. The Greaves became part of the village's myth, not as people with a secret, but as people who had always been there. The grandmother passed one winter morning, in her sleep, her hands folded over a quilt she had finished weeks earlier. The village mourned her. No one guessed that they buried not just a woman, but a living archive of power and memory. Her grave was marked with a simple stone carved by Thomas, and on the back, hidden beneath the grass, was an inscription in a language only 3 people in the world still understood. Time, ever relentless, moved on. The children became adults. Eli left for a year to study forestry under a new name, returning with calloused hands and a quiet resolve. Nora pursued restoration of old buildings, forgotten books, and broken stained glass. They never told their new friends the full truth, only fragments that passed as stories of simpler loss and chosen silence. Thomas and Elena aged with grace. Their work slowed, their presence deepened. They were consulted by neighbors, respected by the mayor, and trusted by all. They no longer feared discovery, not because they were invincible, but because they had become indistinguishable from the life they lived. The world above them shifted politics, economies, wars, but they remained untouched, not by chance, but by mastery. Their wealth still existed, dormant, protected. Every year, Thomas adjusted a single global investment, just enough to maintain the system that protected their freedom. Every decade, Elena sent a sealed note to the only bank that still remembered their names. They didn't use the money. They merely ensured it couldn't be used by anyone else. One day, long after the children had grown and the village had changed its shape slightly with time, a historian arrived. He wasn't from any agency, nor was he a journalist. He came to research regional customs and dialects. He passed through the village with notebooks and a kind smile. He asked harmless questions, stayed at the inn, and noticed nothing remarkable. On his last day, he saw a painting in the chapel, an image of the valley in spring, signed only with an initial. He lingered. There was something about the brushwork, the balance of technique and tenderness. He made a note in his journal, then he left, and nothing came of it. The Greaves family had won, not by hiding, but by becoming. And in the quiet of their stone home, warmed by sun and time, they remained no longer the richest family in the world, but perhaps the wealthiest in what truly mattered. They had been powerful once, now they were free.